Code-on-time app generators, globalization and localization features allow us to easily translate application elements such as button labels and page names. However, what if we want to also localize the data in our application? Let's learn how to do that. Using SQL Server Management Studio, we'll want to go ahead and create a new table. This table will store our translations. Let's add a field called Translation ID, which will be used for the primary key and be specified as an identity field. We will want to store the phrase, the translation for the phrase, as well as the language for this translation. Make sure to save the table. Let's take a quick peek of what we'll save in the database. First, the user will go ahead and modify some data. The data will be automatically translated and saved into the table. When the record is loaded again, then the data will be pulled from the table and displayed, depending on the user's currently selected language. Let's refresh our project to pick up the new table. Make sure to check the box next to the database schema has changed recently. Next, let's create a model for our new table. Next, make sure that Shared Business Rules is enabled. Let's enable data access objects for the new model so that we can easily work with translations in our code business rules. Open the Project Designer. Under the Controllers tab, select Translations Controller and enable Generate Data Access Objects. We'll want to generate the project to allow the relevant files to be created. Once generation is complete, let's open the project in Visual Studio. We will add some code to the Shared Business Rules file that will perform automatic translation on saving or editing any records in our application. Expand App Code, Custom, and Rules folder, and open the Shared Business Rules file. The first step we'll want to do is add an after SQL action that will iterate through all the values in the current request and translate them as necessary. Let's overwrite the method after SQL action. If the controller is not translations, and the current command is an update or an insert, if the conditions match, then we'll iterate through all the values. If the value is modified, and the new value isn't null, and the value is a string, then we'll translate the resource. Let's go ahead and see a sample debug session that will show us what the expected values will be. You can see the controller suppliers, the command name is update, and the first field value is company name. We can see that it's modified, and the new value is exotic liquids 2. This means we'll go ahead and try to translate it. The translate resource will first check to see if the translations table already contains a translation for that certain text. If it doesn't, we'll query Google and get the Google translation. We'll use the translations data access object to access the translations controller. Next, we'll need to write a little bit of code to query the Google Translate API and fetch the translation. You can go ahead and paste your API key here. Let's jump back to our sample debugging session. First, we'll select a single record from the translations table, see if it's null. If so, we'll iterate through all our supported cultures. You can see that the culture is ENUS, ENUS. We'll want to split it up and grab the first part. Then we'll query Google by building an HTTP web request and processing the response as JSON. You can see the JSON returned from Google on the screen here. You can see that Google gave us back a translation, and we'll go ahead and insert that text into the table for the culture. Finally, we'll need one last method that, whenever the user makes a request, goes and checks the response to try to translate any field values that may be present to the desired language. If the current controller is not translations, we'll iterate through the fields on the page, looking for any fields of type string and that don't have a null value. If we don't, then we'll go ahead and query the translations table and try to find a translation for the current culture. If we've found the translation, then we'll update the field value so that the user sees the translated value for that piece of data. Let's jump back to our debugging session. In this case, the controller is suppliers, so we'll iterate through the page fields. We'll find company name, which is a field of string type. We'll fetch the field value, which is exotic liquids 2. And we'll go ahead and try to select the translation for that text from the translations table based on the current thread's UI culture. If we've found it, then we'll set the field value to the translation we have. Let's review the code one more time. First, we've added a method after every single action that checks to see if it's not the controller translations and the command name is insert or update. If so, we'll iterate through the values looking for any strings that aren't null, and we'll attempt to add translations to our table. The method that implements the translations will try to find any existing translations. If it does, then it will not proceed. Otherwise, it will iterate through all our enabled cultures and query Google to get the translation. If it gets a translation correctly, then it will save it to our translations table. The method that gets a Google translation will make a query passing the text to translate, the language to translate in, and your API key. If it succeeds, then it will go ahead and read the JSON response and return the translated text. The final method will be triggered every time any row anywhere is selected. If the controller is not translations, it'll try to find any string fields with a non-null string value. If it finds it, it'll go ahead and try to find a translation and update the field value with that translation. Let's see this in action. If we navigate to our suppliers page, we can see that all the data is currently in English. Let's go ahead and update a field value. And save. Notice that the data is presented to us in French, which is our currently enabled language. If we switch to German, the text will be in German. If we jump over to products, we can notice that the supplier company name is translated here as well. We could also jump over to the translations page and modify any translations as necessary. These are just some of the many ways that Code on Time allows your applications to easily be supported for a global audience.